All right, we're ready for Judges chapter 9 is where we are. This is our outline that we are following throughout the study of chapters 1 and 2 being apathy. We are in 3 to 16, which deals with apostasy, and then we'll get to the anarchy. Under the matter of apostasy, we have various judges we'll get to in just a moment. We're now dealing with Abimelech, beginning at chapter 9. Abimelech, Tola, and Jair is dealt with in chapters 9 and first part of chapter 10. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Now let's talk about the cycle. This is something interesting because we've looked at this cycle each time going through the cycle, but that cycle is not specifically mentioned in our study tonight, and you'll see why that's the case. But I keep reminding you of this cycle. They serve the Lord, they fall into sin, Israel is oppressed, they cry out to the Lord. The Lord sends a judge, but that's not necessarily what happened this time. And then Israel is delivered and they serve the Lord. And you'll see why I say that here in just a moment. This is Micah's outline I've shared with you several times. I like it. It deals with the need for the judges, the work of the judges, and the time of the judges. We're dealing with the work of the judges. If we're keeping up and hopefully memorizing some of this that we have dealt with, we're now dealing with our sixth judge. Or fifth judge, we might say. I'll tell you why I say fifth or sixth, depending on whether we think Abimelech was a judge or not. We'll come to that in a moment. But we've dealt with Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, and Abimelech. So hopefully you're memorizing that. We have a little more to remember each time. But we're going to be through with Abimelech in our study tonight, unlike Gideon, whom we studied about in 3 sessions. So let's raise this question before we get into chapter 9 itself, and that is, should Abimelech be considered as a judge? And in some of the lists that you see of judges, he'll be left off of that list. And in others, he is found on the list. And so in answer to the question, some say no, he should not be considered as a judge. He's an important character we've got to study about because he's found right here in our text. And then others say yes. Under the answer of no, here's the reasons for that. He's never called a judge. There's never a statement in the chapter about Abimelech judged Israel so many years, 3 years, 10 years, 40 years, whatever it was. There's not a statement about him being a judge. He's never called a judge, never referred to as a judge. In the case of the other judges, God raised up a judge. And there is no indication that God called him to do anything, much less be a judge. All the calling seems to be on the part of Abimelech. And so those are pretty strong arguments that he would not be considered a judge, perhaps. Then there is not an oppressive nation that's involved. So you read all of chapter 9, and there's not like the Midianites or the Moabites, who have come in, or the Philistines who've come in and oppressed the people, and God gave them over because they went into sin, and then God raised up a judge. That's been the cycle we've gone through. That's not mentioned here. So if we stop at that juncture, that's pretty good evidence that he's probably not to be considered as a judge. But on the side of that, yes, he is to be considered as one of the judges, is the fact that he ruled over Israel. Now, we'll come to the question in a moment, did he rule over all of Israel, only a portion of Israel? That's another question that we'll deal with a little later in our context. But I think the strongest of those arguments would be from chapter 10 and in verse 1, we have similar language that is used with reference to the other judges. And that is, after Abimelech, there arose to save Israel Tola. Well, that's the same kind of language that was used with reference to other judges, that after he died, then this happened and God rose up and here came this other judge. And so similar language is used here with reference to the other judges. And furthermore, this is not the strongest of arguments, but he's traditionally been viewed as one of the judges. So while some list of judges will leave him off, most of the list of judges of anybody's material you look at will have him listed as one of the judges. And so I think he probably is to be considered as a judge, though he's never called that. So that's not a major issue. That's not a thing that I'm going to fall out with you over or even argue with you. I've given you both sides of that. I'm going to leave it at that. And if you think, well, I think he is a judge, well, then good. If you think he's not, well, then good. That's fine too. This is our timetable of the judges. We've dealt with Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, and we went further with Gideon, and now here's Abimelech down here. Now Abimelech is listed under, notice down here we have the judges up there, but this is the oppression. He's not listed as a judge here, but he's listed as a part of the oppression in this particular. This is from Bible Manna. And they were viewing him not as one of the judges, but as part of the oppression, much like the Midianites and the Amalekites and the Philistines. But he's part of that oppression before Tola rises up and begins to lead. Now, I'm going to leave that with you. I don't know what your conclusion is concerning that, but we're going to leave it at that and go to chapter 9. Let's go to question number 1 for tonight. Write a short summary of chapter 9. What's chapter 9 about? All right, it's dealing with the sin and fall of Abimelech, to whom we were introduced in the last chapter, and we'll come to that here in just a second. Let's go ahead and get verses 1 to 6 out of the way. Question on verses 1 to 6. Question number 2, and that is, what did Abimelech plan to do? Okay, absolutely. Going to kill his brothers so he could be the king or be the ruler or be the leader. His father was a judge, obviously, but toward the end of Gideon's life, he lived more like a king and lived more of the lifestyle of a king, and perhaps that's part of the downfall of him. One writer says, this is the longest chapter in the book of Judges and the most depressing of all the chapters. Pretty good observation. This is not an encouraging chapter at all from the vantage point of you see great faith, you see great victory, you see people turning back to the Lord. We see Abimelech's sin and downfall. Now, what's the point of the chapter? It deals with Abimelech. He rose himself up and promoted himself as a leader. We'll list a number of sins in a moment that can be found in the context that he was guilty of. He collapses and he falls, is what we're going to see. And those who supported him fell. So what would be the purpose for this being included in the inspired text? And it seems to be that God is allowing his people to see the atrocities of the behavior of a scandal like Abimelech. That when you have leaders like Abimelech, scoundrels like Abimelech leading, look at how atrocious that is. And furthermore, perhaps, to see the tragedy of a king. Now, there are some good kings later on in the period of the kings. David was a good king. But by and large, the kings during the united and the divided kingdom were worthless, most of them. And so God's warning them of the tragedy of there being a king. Because here was an attempt to be a king, and then here's someone else attempts to be a king. And there'd been talk of a king even before this. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later. All right, let's start at verses 1 to 6. Here we have a conspiracy to kill his brothers so that he may be the leader. Now let's go back to chapter 8 to remind ourselves, since some of us were not here last week, and it may be in a little while since you've read chapter 8. The death of Gideon, starting at verse 29, that Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, another name for Gideon, dwelt in his own house, and he had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives. And then verse 31 said, and his concubine, who was in Sheikham, also bore him a son, whose name was called Abimelech. And I'm told that name means my father is king. Now, there's some question among students as to whether the 70 sons, because this comes a little bit later, may come up in your mind later in the text. It didn't occur to me till I got to the end of the text, to the possibility of raising this question. I'm reading in chapter 8, and I'm assuming they had 70 sons, making 69 plus Abimelech, making 70, and he killed 70 sons, but Jotham escaped. So where is the number? I take it that these are probably 70 plus Abimelech. But he killed 70, so he didn't kill himself. He comes a little bit later. Probably the 70 in the chapter, that is chapter 9, is dealt with in the same sense of the 12. The disciples in John 20, and also 1 Corinthians 15 are called the 12, though they were missing one. There was only 11, but they were called the 12, because that was the total group number when they started. Make sense? So the 70 that he killed may not have been exactly 70, may have been 69, may have been 70, may have been 68, but that was the total number, apparently, of the brothers, at least the legitimate brothers. But anyway, where I was headed with all of that, back in verse 31, was Abimelech is the son of a concubine. And so he was not viewed by some of the other brothers as being the same as they are, and she was from Sheikham. And so we take that she was, the mother of Abimelech was probably a Canaanite. Most likely. We see that some evidence of that here in verses 1 to 6. So let's get underway with verses 1 to 6. Abimelech came to his mother's brothers. He came to Sheikham. Now before we get very far, let's just find Sheikham on the map, and then we'll come back to our, Sheikham is right here on the border between Ephraim and Manasseh, right here is Sheikham. And then we're going to read about Thebez a little bit later. And so he went to Sheikham. Sheikham was a notable city. I don't have time to go back and trace all that took place at Sheikham, but it was a notable city in the history of the people of God, even prior to this point. And then later it's even a significant city. But he came to Sheikham and came to his mother's household, and he spoke in their hearing, and his question was what? Verse 2. Implying, though he doesn't say this, Daddy's gone. Daddy's dead. Daddy was the ruler. Daddy was the leader. He's dead and gone. Yeah. Which would you rather have? 70, in other words, he's different. I'm from a concubine. And they're all from legitimate wives. And would you rather have 70 rule over you? Or would you rather have one? So look at the wording of verse 2. Which is better for you, that the 70 sons of Jerubbaal reign over you, or one reign over you? Remember, I am your own flesh and blood. Now there's two things he said in that. One is he presented them, and we'll come to this a little bit later in our practical lessons. He presented two alternatives to them. Are there any others? In other words, you've got a choice, 70 ruling over you, or one ruling over you. There might be another alternative. Could not one of those 70 rule over them? In other words, he presents two alternatives, and obviously one is better than 70 ruling over them. So he presents two alternatives as if they're the only two alternatives. That's a technique of misleading people. We'll come to that a little bit later in practical lessons. Think about that for a little bit. Yes, sir. Yeah. He had refused to accept that. No. That's not going to happen. He said he'd not, but that he lived like a king toward the end of his life. But then here's the second thing he said. Good point. The second thing at verse 2 is, remember that I'm your own flesh and bone. What's his point? Yeah. Yeah, I've got the same father, and but I'm your flesh and blood. In other words, because of the mother, she was from Sheikham. They all had the same father, but I'm of this family, of this city, and I'm one of y'all, and they're not. So here's the point. Daddy's gone. Daddy's dead. And somebody's going to be the leader. Somebody needs to be the leader. Would you rather have those 70 that are not even your flesh and blood, different mothers, they're not even from this area, but I'm from this area, I'm your flesh and blood, I'm one of you, or would you rather have me as one ruling over you? Well, what was their answer? We'd rather have you. Verse 3. And their heart was inclined to follow Abimelech, for he is our brother. And then what did they do? Verses 4 and 5. All right. Let's go through verse 4, dissect it a little bit. Where'd they get this money? From the temple of Beareth. In other words, this is idolatry money from an idol temple. And so that suggests to me that even Abimelech has leaned toward idolatry, number one. And the people of Sheikham are heavily leaning toward idolatry, number two. And they go get money from the temple of the idols and give it to Abimelech to go hire then some worthless and reckless men. These are hasty men. They have no scruples at all, and apparently men who'll do anything to get a piece of silver. In other words, if you want us to follow you, pay us and we'll follow you. But if somebody else will pay us a little more, we'll follow them. They're worthless. They're worthless and reckless men. They're hasty, no scruples, do anything for a price. In other words, what's the danger of that? There's a practical lesson in that. This is how he's going to get a following. He hires a following. They were easily turned to him. They will also easily turn from him. Be careful how you get your following. We'll come back to that as a practical thing if time permits. And so then he went to his father's house in Orpha. And what did he do there? He killed 70 sons of Gideon on one stone, on one rock. Means of execution. I'm not sure this is the point or the play, but some would suggest that he killed his brothers on a stone, and later he was killed with a stone. I don't know if there's any significance of that other than playing on stone a little bit. Verse 5 says that Jotham, the youngest, escaped and he hid himself. Now what do we learn from verse 6 to finish that section? All right, the men of Sheikham gathered together and all of Beth Millo, and they went and made Abimelech king beside the terebinth tree at the pillar that was at Sheikham. Now, let us stop here just for a moment. In chapter 8, there was this effort to make him king, rule over us. Back at verse 22, George mentioned that a moment ago, both you and your sons. We want a king. And so we talked a little last week about how here is an attitude that begins to rise up, but it doesn't come to fruition yet. That is in the day of Gideon. We want to make you king. There is a desire to have a king like other nations, but it doesn't get very far. But it's going to get a little further now because someone's going to be appointed as king. But it doesn't last long. It only lasts 3 years, and it fizzles. And then someone else tries to rise up and overtake him, and it doesn't last very long, and it fizzles. But eventually, that attitude is going to come to fruition. Make sense? I'm learning something from that. I'm learning from this chapter. I'm learning from the previous chapter some practical stuff. And we'll come back to, I'm planting some seed for that at this moment. All right. Anything else on verses 1 to 6? The conspiracy to kill his brothers that he may be the leader. Some have labeled the chapter, I'm not sure this is the thrust of that, but the failure due to the failed family or something to that effect. And they based that coming out of chapter 8 that here he had many wives, which wasn't according to God's plan, but he had a concubine, which really wasn't according to God's plan. And because he's having children by many wives and concubines, then here is the failure that comes into play as we come into chapter 8. I'll just leave that with you for what that may be worth. All right, let's talk about Jotham's rebuke of Abimelech and the men of Sheikham. Now, there's a parable, and some suggest that that's better called not a parable, but a fable. The technical distinction would come into play that a parable is either something that really happens or something that could really happen. A sower went forth to sow, and he does. Now, that's a story, but that could really happen. There's none of the parables of Jesus where the event couldn't really happen. This is a story that has trees talking. Now, that can't really happen. So maybe it is a fable, but it is a parable in the sense that there is a story with a point to be made, and that's the word parable just simply means to lay beside. All right, now somebody tell me, what is the parable? What's the point? Question number 3. I've got to explain the parable, but let's first tell what the parable was, or the fable. Okay, very good. All right, let's go through that now. The olive tree goes to, would you reign over us? Would you be king? And no, because I'm busy producing olives. And so they go to the fig tree. Would you? No, I can't do that because I'm busy producing figs. Go to the vine. Well, no, I can't do that, and I won't do that because I'm busy producing wine. So they come to the bramble bush. The thorn bush, basically. It's a worthless bush. Would you reign over us? And he says that he will. Said, if in truth you anoint me as king over you, then come and take shelter in my shade. What do you make of that? Doesn't have much shade. He's making promises he can't give. He's promising more than he can give. Come and take shelter under my shade. I'll be your king. I'll reign over the forest, and I'll be the ruler of all the trees. This is a bramble bush, a worthless bush that doesn't have any shade, but I'll give you shade. He's promising things he can't give. But if not, let fire come out from the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. In other words, if you want to make me king, then I'll be king. But if not, may there be a consequence for you not willing for me to be your king. Well, isn't that interesting? Because this is exactly what's going to happen. Now let's get to the explanation. Same question, number 3. What's the explanation of that? Found in verses 16 to 21. An application. The application, let's get to the punchline at the end, because that's what's really interesting. Jotham is a brother, half-brother at least, to Abimelech. He escaped Abimelech tried to kill him, but he escaped from that. And let's go back just for a moment to verse 7. He goes to Mount Gerizim and lifted up his voice. I understand there's a spot at Mount Gerizim, I'm told by some of the writers, that the acoustics are such that it echoes like as if you had a PA system. And can you imagine him echoing through so that Israel hears? And he is saying, in essence, that Abimelech is nothing but a bramble bush that's worthless and can't do what he claims he can do. He's a worthless, useless leader. That's what he's saying. But let's get how he got there. Beginning at verse 16. Now therefore, if you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech your king, I've lost my place. Where am I? Verse 16. And if you have dealt well with Jeroboam and his house, and have done as he deserves. In other words, if you have done the right thing in doing all of this, for my father fought. Now here's a note about what his father was. He fought and risked his life to deliver you from the hand of Midian. And remember the fact that chapter 8, verse 23, that neither Gideon nor any of his worthy sons were inclined to rule. They had declined. We're not going to rule. But you have risen up against my father's house and killed the 70 sons on one stone and made Abimelech the king. I'm reading it, verse 18, over the men of Sheikham because he is your brother. In other words, it's all based on mistrust. You don't trust any of the rest of them, and I don't trust you either. Now verse 19, let's go and get through verse 21 and see if there's any questions or comments. But if you have acted in truth and sincerity, this day rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. So the point of the parable is, or the fable, is if you've done the right thing and making him your king, then rejoice and take the consequences, and you've got what you deserve. One writer says that he's saying to the men of Sheikham, y'all deserve each other. You men of Sheikham and Abimelech, y'all deserve each other. I sometimes think that's true of our nation. Sometimes the leaders we elect, because of the corruption in our nation, we deserve the leaders we elected. Kind of go hand in hand sometimes, doesn't it? Look at verse 19. Rejoice in Abimelech and let him rejoice in you. That is sounding like y'all deserve each other. Y'all are two peas in a pod. And you deserve a leader like this, you men of Sheikham. Now, verse 20. What's 20 and 21 say? If not, in other words, if you didn't do the right thing in killing these brothers and making him king, if that was wrong, then let exactly. Let fire come from Abimelech and devour the men of Sheikham and Beth Milo, and let fire come from the men of Sheikham and Beth Milo and devour. In other words, y'all gonna eat each other up. You're going to destroy each other. Y'all deserve each other. And you're going to destroy each other is what's going to happen. He's going to destroy you, and you're going to destroy, there's going to be a problem between you. And indeed, that's the case. And then Jotham ran away, and for fear of Abimelech, his brother. So, that's his rebuke. Now, basically, he's made a prophecy here. Whether he's intending to be a prophet, or whether God is speaking prophecy through him is another question. But basically, he's prophesied that Sheikham is going to be destroyed, and so is Abimelech going to be destroyed. He had two parts of his prophecy. Both parts came true. Make sense? All right. Any questions or comments down through verse 21? I don't recall, but I think you're right. I think it's the only case. But don't hold me to that. I think that's right. I may correct that later but I'm not remembering a case where the family thought, because Daddy was, I'm going to be the leader. Somebody's got to be the leader. It's got to be me or one of the brothers, and it's going to be me. I don't remember another case in the case of the judges. Maybe later in the kings, but not in the case of the judges. That I remember anyway. Good question, though. Question number 4, what caused the downfall of Abimelech? All right, his pride. What else? I'm sorry. God brought an evil spirit, absolutely. One writer mentioned a number of sins that I hadn't particularly thought about all of these. When we put them together, then yeah, it makes sense. Verses 1 and 2, selfish ambition, self-promoting. Number 2, idolatry, verse 4, we've already talked about. Number 3, there's murder at verse 5. We've already got 3 of those already. Verse 6, dishonesty. He killed his brothers. He's being dishonest. Takes on the role of king when God hadn't appointed him as a king. And number 5, his pride is evidence in verses, down through verse 21, the verses we've just covered. Or covering now. That is, so there's a number of sins that brought his downfall that we could talk about. Anything else on down through verse 21? All right, let's start at verse 22 now, and down through the end of the chapter. Abimelech is killed, but several things happen in this story. There's an ill will of the men of Sheikham toward Abimelech. This is going to be a case where God, the wording in the text says God sent a spirit of ill will. I'll come back to verse 22. I'm not skipping that. But verse 23, God sent a spirit of ill will. I don't think that means, though if you want to think so, I'll be glad to listen to the reason. I don't think that means that God arbitrarily said, I'm going to give you ill will. Any more than God leads men into temptation, Matthew 6. There's a sense in which he does, but he doesn't arbitrarily do it. He allows it. And I think this is one of the many cases where God allows something that he may not cause, and God uses it, and I think that's the point. But anyway, back to verse 22. Abimelech had reigned over Israel 3 years, the text says. Now, the text never says he reigned over all of Israel. So if we took everything else out of chapter 9 and just zeroed in on verse 22, Abimelech reigned over Israel, we might get the picture he reigned over all of Israel. And so he's reigning as a king over all of Israel. It's never said that he reigned over all Israel. He hardly reigned past western Manasseh. And so it was more of a localized leadership as far as anything that's indicated here in the text. There's nothing said about any other of the tribes being involved in this. But he only reigned 3 years. And those 3 years were involved in conflict. And so he only reigned 3 years. And so how long did he reign was a short period of time that he was in leadership. Now let's look at verses 23, 24, and 25. What do we see in that text? We've already mentioned that God sent a spirit of ill will. What goes on in 23, 24, and 25? How much time has lapsed, we're not told. But they've made him king, but it's not long. I mean, the very people who said, we want you to be king, and you're our brother, and you be our king. The very people who did that are now setting out to do what to him? Kill him. They're going to assassinate him. Because, let's look at verse 23. This ill will, the men of Sheikham dealt treacherously with him, and the crime done of the 70 sons might be settled and laid on his head. Now, at verse 25, the men of Sheikham set men in ambush against him on the top of the mountain, robbed all who passed by. Now, I don't think it's just, oh, by the way, they decided to rob some people. It seems that because they're setting out to target him, they're setting to rob people and hoping Abimelech comes along and they're going to rob and kill him. So this ill will, the spirit of ill will in verse 22 or verse 23 is leading to the point they're ready to assassinate him. They're done with him. They wanted him to be king, but it didn't take long. How long, I don't know, but I know it was less than 3 years. But not too far into his administration, they're ready to kill him. Now, beginning at verse 26, we're introduced to a man, Gaal. Question number 5, who led in the revolt against Abimelech? Gaal, son of Ebed. We don't know much about him. He led in an insurrection. We hear a lot about insurrection in our day and time. But he did lead in an insurrection, and he's trying to overthrow the supposed king, Abimelech. And so what happens here at 26, 27, and 28? And 29. Let's get down to verse 29, then we'll finish the rest of that. Yeah, he came to the brothers over at Sheikham and with his brothers over to Sheikham. In other words, he's not a person of Sheikham. He's not a Sheikhamite. But he comes with his family over to Sheikham, and the men of Sheikham put their confidence in him. What does that tell you about Sheikham so far? They're fickle, yeah. A man comes along and says, hey, I'm one of your brothers, and I'll be your leader. Had you rather follow me or follow we'll follow you. Let's make you king. Let's give you 70 pieces of silver. Let's go get you a following. And then someone else comes along while Abimelech is away from the city. And, hey, we like you. You be our leader. And so they went into the fields, and they gathered grapes and vineyards, etc., and they began to make merry. What is this telling you? And in the house of their gods, and they drank, and they cursed Abimelech. What's Gael doing? He's with the men of Sheikham and basically having a drunken feast, isn't he? I mean, this is just, they're just drinking and lose all sense of reality. Notice it, verse 28 now. Gael begins to say to them, who is Abimelech and who is Sheikham that we should serve him? What's his point? He mentions his father. Is not he the son of Jerubbaal? Was Jerubbaal or Gideon, that's another name for Gideon, was he from Sheikham? No, but his mother was. This seems to be, though some argue against this seems to be a slur against Abimelech. And he's trying to drum up support by slamming Abimelech, and basically his argument seems to be he's not a true Sheikhamite like you thought he was. His father's not one of you. And why should we follow a man who's a son of a Jew? His mother seems to be a Canaanite. And as we've already mentioned, and why should we follow this man who's a descendant of a Jew? Why should we do that? And so his argument, he's not a true Sheikhamite, so why follow him? And if only this people were under my hand, I would remove Abimelech. And so he sent message to Abimelech, increase your army. In other words, I'm ready to fight against him. He's running his mouth while he's talking, while he's at this drunken festival. All right, in the interest of time, let's get go down a little bit further. Beginning at verse, where are we? Verse 30. Who is Zebul? He's basically Abimelech's right-hand man, isn't he? And notice how unwise it is on the part of Gael to run his mouth right in front of Zebul, because what does he do then? He goes to Abimelech, tells him exactly what's going on, and tells him to get ready and to rise up in the morning, down through verse 33, and you'll be able to attack him. He's in the city. In other words, he's trying to rule in the city of Sheikham, which is set themselves against you. If you come and take the city, you'll be able to take him. And let's do it the next day. Well, the strategy seems to be that there's drunken parties going on the night before. They're not going to be in any shape to fight. So Abimelech, you come and fight these drunken men who are going to be in a stupor perhaps. So beginning now at verse 34, down through verse 41 now. What happens in down through verse 41? Abimelech and his men come against the city. And when Gael saw the people, yeah, put your money where your mouth is. You were running your mouth last night saying, boy, if I could just get a hold of him and fight against him, I'd take him out. Put your money where your mouth is. Do what you say you're going to do. Stand up and fight like you say you're going to fight. And so he's egging him on to come on out and fight with him because he knows the downfall of him. And where indeed, look at verse 38, where indeed is your mouth now when you said Abimelech, why should we serve him? And are not these people despised? And so he went out leading the men of Sheikham. And what happened now at 40 and 41? Abimelech chased them and they fled. Many were wounded. Out of Sheikham. And we don't see them anymore. He wasn't much of a leader, was he? He's kind of out of the picture now. He was kind of trying to lead an insurrection and he's gone. Now let's begin at verse 42. I want to get down to some practical things and have time for that here in just a second. Abimelech destroys the men of Sheikham and the city. 42 to 45, what does Abimelech do? The next day after this battle, what do the people do? They go out into the fields. Seemingly they think this insurrection and the conflict is over. And so they go out into their fields, and Abimelech divides his men into 3 companies, and what does he do? Yeah, he rushes in and he kills all that were in the field. Verse 44, and he fought against the city, and then he took the city and killed the people that were in it. and he demolished the city, and he sowed it with salt. What does that suggest? Can't sow anymore. Their fields are going to be ruined, and basically it's symbolic of we're done with this city, but basically destroys the city and any growing of any crops in the city. And so he sows it with salt, and he's done. He's wiped the city out. So part of the prophecies come true. Sheikham has been destroyed by Abimelech. These are the very people that made him king. And he's turned around and destroyed the city and killed the people. Now then, verses 46 to 49, what happens? Yeah, it's called the Tower of Sheikham, a stronghold of the temple of the god of Beareth. And so there's three things that are mentioned here that probably, there were some archaeologists from Harvard many years ago who went and did some study they came to the conclusion, whether true or not, at least I'm just reflecting their conclusion, that the Tower of Sheikham and the house of Beareth and the house of Millo were all the same place. It was a stronghold, a fort that was a tower, but it could house a number of people, and they went there for shelter. Some suggest, thinking this is the temple of our God, and Abimelech, if he was worshiping those same gods, which verse 4 may imply that, he won't attack this, and because of his reverence for these gods. I don't know if that was their case or not. So what did Abimelech do? Set it on fire and burned it. And he destroyed how many? 1,000. All right, let's go to the last section here, or next to the last section. Abimelech is killed just a few miles away at Thebez. He goes and attacks that city. And what happens when he gets too close to the tower over there? He gets ready to do the same thing. He's going to burn the tower. And what happens? She drops a millstone. It's called an upper millstone. This seems to be a small millstone. Some have suggested 4 to 5 pounds, that there was a large millstone that would be turned by a donkey. That's probably not what was used, but a smaller millstone that women used to hand grind the crops with. And she threw that out on his head from the top of the tower and crushed his skull. And his reaction was, so it couldn't be said that a woman killed him. What's interesting is, if you don't have this in a marginal note somewhere, 2 Samuel 11:21, much later it was still said he was killed by a woman. It didn't do him much good to have his armor bearer kill him. Because it didn't change the truth of the matter. The reason he's dying is because a woman had thrown a millstone upon him and killed him. And now the second part of the prophecy has come true, and he has died. Now, verse 56 and 57, I want to get this quickly, and I want to hit a couple of practical things. God is repaying Abimelech and the men of Sheikham for the evil that they did. God is repaying them all for the evil that they did, and that's the story line. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these. I just wanted to hit a couple of those. Verse 2, you can be misled by being given only 2 alternatives when there's more. A false teacher can do that. Are you going to believe this or this? And there may be another alternative. So think about that. There's a practical thing. Be careful how you get a following. You can get a following, but be careful how you get that following, because that may turn out to be your disaster. We've talked about attitudes and efforts that rise long before it comes to fruition. They wanted a king, they talked about. It didn't happen. Now they have a king, but it didn't last long. The king's going to come, but it's going to come a little bit later. What other one do I want to mention? Verse 38, we'll stop with this one. Put your money where your mouth is. Here is Gale, who's running his mouth, saying, here's what I would do. Now you've got a chance. Do it. And he's put on the spot. And we may be put on the spot when we run our mouth of what we would do if we were in those shoes. Chapters 10 and 11 next time.